Hi, everyone. So I think we'll go ahead and begin. On behalf of my colleagues at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, which is also known as SIMS, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture, the first of this fall's SIMS online lecture series. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Imre Galambos from the University of Cambridge, who will be introduced momentarily by my colleague, Nick Herman, the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator of Manuscripts at SIMS. So for those of you who don't know me or are unfamiliar with the Schoenberg Institute, I should introduce myself and would also like to say a few words about SIMS. My name is Lynn Ransom, and I'm the curator of programs here at the Schoenberg Institute. SIMS is a unit of the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, and guided by the vision of its founder, Lawrence J. Schoenberg, and his wife, Barbara Bristol Schoenberg, both manuscript collectors and longtime patrons of digital manuscript work at Penn Libraries. The mission of SIMS is to bring manuscript culture, modern technology, and people together to bring access to and understanding of our shared intellectual heritage. To that end, we aim to make our resources, programs, and data available to scholars and students around the world. We invite users at all levels to use and contribute to projects such as the Schoenberg Database of Manuscripts, or VisCall, an online collation tool, or to freely use manuscript data available in OPIN, our fully open access repository of metadata and images. You can find out more about these and other projects by visiting our website at schoenberginstitute.org, and we'll paste links to this and some other things I'll be mentioning in the chat later. So in addition to making data available to the world, we also seek to bring scholars to Penn to study our manuscripts through a series of programs, including a visiting research fellowship that brings up to 3 scholars a year to campus for a month to research our pre-modern manuscript and digital collections. We will be opening a call for that program in March, and more information regarding the program can be found on our website. We also host the annual Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age, now in its 14th year. And I'm excited to officially announce this year's symposium on the topic loss that will take place online from November 17th to 19th. We've gathered an exciting and richly diverse group of speakers who will be addressing loss in manuscript studies from a variety of angles, whether it is loss in or of manuscripts, loss of knowledge or cultural heritage, loss in the context of trauma, or loss in digital spaces, among many other threads. For more information, we will post a link to the website with the program and registration details in the chat. In addition to these programs, we also publish a biannual journal called Manuscript Studies, which aims to embrace the full complexity of global manuscript studies through both traditional and digital scholarship. We're actively seeking submissions for the fall 2022 and beyond. And if you're interested in submitting, please feel free to contact us at any time if you have any questions. We're also delighted to be able to host events such as today's lecture, and to be able to do this virtually to include people who wouldn't otherwise be able to come to a lecture on our campus. We welcome all newcomers today and hope to see you at our next event in the series, Growing a Research Network, Approaches to Global Book History, which is to be presented by Professor Suzanne Conklin-Akbari from the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton and Alexandra Gillespie at the University of Toronto. So without further ado, Nick, I hand the screen over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's nice to see so many people here, both people we know well and others who are new to us. So welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, the first of our fall semester, as Lynn said, Dr. Imre Galambos. Dr. Galambos is reader in Chinese in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge University. And he trained in China before completing a PhD dissertation at UC Berkeley in 2002 on Chinese writing during the Warring States period. So a period roughly contemporaneous with classical and Hellenistic Greece. Dr. Galambos worked then for about a decade at the British Library as a team member on the international Dunhuang project. This vast international project, which is still ongoing, aims to describe, conserve, and digitize thousands of scrolls and other textual artifacts from the region around Dunhuang, major cultural crossroads at the eastern end of the so-called Silk Road. The region is famous for the Mogao Caves complex and the discovery in the early 20th century of the so-called Library Cave, which had been walled up in the early 11th century CE, and which was found to contain tens of thousands of manuscripts in Chinese and in a host of other Central Asian languages. And we can sort of imagine it as a kind of distant relative, perhaps, of the Cairo Geniza. Since 2012, Dr. Galambos has been on the faculty at Cambridge, where he continues to research, teach, and publish on Dunhuang manuscript culture in the Guiyijun period, roughly equivalent in chronology to the turn of the second millennium CE. Dr. Galambos' publications include Manuscripts and Travelers, the Sino-Tibetan documents of a 10th century Buddhist pilgrim from 2011, co-authored with Sam Van Schaik, as well as the monographs Translating Chinese Tradition and Teaching Tangut Culture, Manuscripts and Printed Books from Karakoto from 2015, and from last year, Dunhuang Manuscript Culture in the Studies in Manuscript Cultures series from De Gruyter. I have a copy of it right here. His most recent work examines pre-modern translations of Chinese texts into other languages, such as Tibetan, Tangut, and Old Uyghur, languages employed in the region that we commonly refer to today as the Silk Road. Dr. Galambos' work, by attending closely to the material record, attempts to answer how and why these texts came to be translated in order to shed light on their function and meaning for those who used them. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Galambos.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this very elaborate and very nice introduction. I want to thank, first of all, the Schoenberg Institute for inviting me to give this talk. It is really a privilege to talk to people outside my field, outside of Chinese studies, and to try to convey some of the some of the excitement or some of the interesting things that we study. And then also thanks to Lynn Ransom and Nick Herman for organizing this thing. So I'm going to share my screen because it's going to be a PowerPoint presentation. Here it is. So the topic for this talk is between Central and East Asia. And the point is that I'm trying to convey here is that we normally, at least people working on the Chinese tradition, look at Chinese manuscripts and the Chinese textual tradition as something inherently Chinese and kind of bound by the even the political or physical boundaries of the Chinese empires. And what I want to share here and what I want to emphasize in my research is that this is actually not really the case, because it was a very open, an open empire, as Valerie Hansen puts it. There were lots of connections, and I'm looking at this northwestern Chinese region, which we normally call the Silk Road today. And I'm trying to show how many different connections there were with other cultures. So just to show you a map of, in terms of Eurasia, because I assume most people are here not dealing with China. So you can see where things are located. And this red dot in the center, or almost the center, is the place where Dunhuang is. So if you can see my cursor, then this large area is modern China. And so Dunhuang is located in its northwestern region, but it's actually, because the Silk Roads are marked here, it's really closely connected with Central Asia, and through Central Asia, Western Asia, and possibly going all the way to Byzantine and European regions. So if we look at the political map of Eurasia, then we can see it's of course very much skewed, as you can see, but nevertheless, we can see the proportions of the dimensions. And we can see that Dunhuang, which is again this red dot here, is really in the northwest. And don't be kind of misled by the fact that it kind of appears sort of in central China, but this whole region to the sort of maybe from half of China towards the west is traditionally a non-Chinese speaking area. So even today, it's a big part of it is taken up by Tibet, and then Xinjiang, it's this self-governing municipality of the Uyghurs, and other regions are also, in other regions, people are speaking other languages. So really, sort of the core of Chinese civilization is on the eastern side or eastern half, where you see many cities. So as you can see on the left, you don't see almost any cities because it's deserts, mountains, and non-Chinese peoples. So this location of Dunhuang is actually quite important because, as you can see, it's actually as close to Kazakhstan, or it's closer to Kazakhstan than, say, to Shanghai or to Peking, and other big cities along the coastal region. So it is it's still kind of part of the traditional Chinese cultural sphere, but it's the edge of it. So this is, it's located in a corridor which is surrounded by mountains and deserts. And that corridor is leading into Central Asia, or Chinese Central Asia. So it's still part of China, but nevertheless, it's, for most of Chinese history, it was not part of the Chinese empires. So in that, near that city, city of Dunhuang, about 35 kilometers southeast of the city, there were these caves in the cliff. This wall goes on for about 1 mile, so actually 1.6 kilometers. And you can see that there are lots of hundreds of these caves carved into the mountainside. Here's another very nice photograph. This is the part which is not very frequently visited. The frequently visited part is this one, and I'm showing a really old engraving of this. This is from the 1881 book of Gustav Kreitner, who was on the expedition, the first Western expedition that came to this region. And they looked at the murals. So these caves, many of these caves, especially in this region of this one mile long cave complex, have lots of murals and statues. And so this expedition was looking at these and describing them. They didn't know about this cache of manuscripts that were discovered about 20 years later, and which we now know as the Dunhuang manuscripts. So these manuscripts were discovered already in 1900, but it was in 1907 when the explorer Aurel Stein, he came to Dunhuang and he acquired a very large collection of them. So here you see a cave which is today called Cave 16, this larger cave, and on the right-hand side, this little window goes into a small cave that's called today Cave 17, and which is known also as the Library Cave. So this is the cave in which tens of thousands of manuscripts are found. And as Nick said, actually, this is quite similar, this kind of discovery, not the discovery, but the collection itself. The manuscripts are quite similar to the Geniza collection, because they span about 600 years, and there was a ceiling of time. So at one point early in the 11th century, in about 1006, the the cave was sealed completely and then was painted over. There was a mural, so nobody knew about it until 1900. So really interestingly, we have this large collection that was dormant for 1,000 years. But we should also know that part of the collection was centuries old when the cave was sealed. And what we see here is a collection of these bundles of scrolls, because many of the scrolls were not just scrolls, but they were put in larger bundles. And these bundles actually, it was only recently recognized that they were an important sort of codicological unit for the manuscripts. And before, kind of, when people found these manuscripts, they did not realize this. And for that reason, much of this, the information relating to the bundles, which scrolls were in which bundles, this was lost. But what we see here is these bundles placed outside, so taken out of this dark, small cave, and they're placed outside of the cave, in a larger cave. And you see here that I wrote that this image is retouched, or this photograph is because actually Stein made a photograph of these manuscripts in this cave, but that didn't come, it got superimposed, it didn't come out well. And so he used another photograph and kind of retouched and put these manuscripts there to make it, I think, by this little trick to make them more authentic in a way. But in reality, it's really kind of, I think, in a way, tampering with the evidence. And so this is a really famous picture of the French scholar Paul Pelliot, who came a few months after Stein in 1908 into the cave. And so Stein already took a large collection out, but you can still see that on the left-hand side, the manuscripts go up to the ceiling. So there's still tens of thousands of manuscripts left here. And on the back wall, you can see part of a mural that was, of course, not seen at the time because of the manuscripts. And so Paul Pelliot sat here in the dark cave with a candle amidst all this paper, and he went through about 1,000 manuscripts a day, choosing the ones he wanted to take with me. Of course, he was not able to take all of them with him. And of course, he had to somehow convince the caretaker of these manuscripts to part with them, well, for some a certain amount of money to part with the manuscripts. And so this is from the Stein collection, which was brought back to London. This is an early photograph of the types of manuscripts that were in this collection. So you see on the top and the bottom, so you have two scrolls. The top one is a manuscript. The bottom one is the famous Diamond Sutra, which is the earliest complete printed, dated printed book in the world from 868, which is on permanent display at the British Library these days. And then you have, for example, here, you have a little booklet with something in Chinese studies we normally call a rubbing. So it's a rubbing of a stele inscription, but in reality, it is not. In reality, it's done by hand. So it's a manuscript imitating a rubbing. So it's a really interesting thing. And then on the right-hand side, you have another print. There were very, very few prints in this collection. This was mostly manuscripts, but nevertheless, they were, I don't know, a couple dozen or maybe 3 dozen prints amidst, let's say, about 50,000 manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts. So they were about, in terms of the volume, they were about 50,000 or maybe 40,000 Chinese manuscripts and more than 20,000 Tibetan ones. And then to lesser degree manuscripts in other languages. So here are the main languages that we see in this collection. Altogether, there are 18 languages and scripts. but here I just list the most important ones. So obviously Chinese is number one, then Tibetan, Old Uyghur, Khotanese, Sogdian, Sanskrit. There's also Old Turkic and a runic, so-called runic script, etc. So this was a very diverse, culturally and linguistically diverse population that lived here. Of course, we might think that this spans 6 centuries. So there were regimes changing and there are lots of things happening. But in reality, most of the manuscripts in all of these languages, they come from the last 100 years, or maybe the last 150 years. So actually, this reflects the multiculturality of one society that lived in Dunhuang from let's say from 850 until 1000. And it's really, really amazing. And let's look a little bit at the history here. So this is the Tang Empire, so Tang China in this turquoise color. This is during the reign of Empress Wu, so the only female emperor in China who reigned from 690 to 705. And what you can see is that this core region of sort of the Chinese cultural sphere has this attachment. Central Asia is added to it. So that dates from the beginning of the Tang period, so a few decades earlier than this. And you see that Dunhuang is really in this corridor. So it's surrounded to the north, there are the Uyghurs, to the south, there are the Tibetans. But this situation only existed for a certain period of time. At this point, what we see on the map, Dunhuang is quite Chinese. So the manuscripts dating to this period are written in Chinese, and they are quite similar to the ones from the central regions of China, and actually from the ones found in Central Asia from the same period. So there was consistency. This empire really functioned well, and so there was consistency and standards that were in place from one end to the other. But if we step forward, we go forward 100 years. Here, it's a different map, but we can see that the situation changed drastically. So Tang, after this revolt by a Sogdian Uyghur general, An Lushan, in the 740s, 50s, the Tang Empire, despite basically succeeding in quelling the revolt, they never recovered fully. And so they lost their Central Asian domains completely. Partly to the Tibetan Empire, which was very, very large and very strong at this point. You can see Dunhuang being here, and Dunhuang became part of the Tibetan Empire for about 70 years. And from this period, we see an obvious influence of Tibetan culture and Tibetan manuscript culture among the manuscripts. What happened after this is that the Tibetan Empire collapsed, the Tang Empire also collapsed and fragmented into smaller polities and regimes. And basically Dunhuang became a regime on its own. So it became a state which claimed alliance first to the Tang Empire, and after the Tang collapsed to some of the successor states. But in reality, it was a de facto independent kingdom at this time. And so it was also at that time the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Khaganate also collapsed, and so the Uyghurs descended south to both sides of Dunhuang. So Dunhuang was completely severed from China, and then it was part of or surrounded by other regimes, the Central Asian kingdoms. Two kinds of Uyghurs on both sides, and then the Tibetans, and it had contacts, very strong, very tight contacts with Khotan in the southern part of the Taklamakan Desert. And we see this reflected in the manuscripts. So this is, for example, a Uyghur Chinese fragment from Dunhuang. There's a Chinese Buddhist scripture, which was probably done during the Tang period. So let's say the 8th century, and the Uyghur is added to it probably in the 10th century. And it's on the same manuscripts. Then this is a really exceptional discovery. This is the so-called Book of Omens, which is basically a divination text, and it's written in the so-called runic script in Old Turkic. And there's Chinese text added after the Uyghur myth. And this is a book, modern type of book, and of over 100 pages. So it's really an important document. The interesting thing is you don't see it from this picture, but it's a tiny, tiny book. So it's probably the size of a passport, or maybe a little bit smaller. And you can see here, you have these red circles or black circles filled in with red. So these are the combinations of the dice. So it's a dice-based divination system, 64 combinations. Here's another interesting bilingual manuscript, a Tibetan Chinese glossary of Buddhist terms. And if you zoom in, you can see how the Tibetan is written on the top, and then Chinese strangely going horizontally from left to right at the bottom, explaining the terms. So what I wanted to focus on today is really these codicological and paleographical innovations during the 10th century. So there are a number of these that are happening at the same time. And I think it's really important to interpret them in terms of the geopolitical and also cultural background of the region. So rather than just seeing them as random occurrences or other developmental aspects, I think it's important to see the contacts between different cultures at this point. So I'll talk about four of these innovations or new developments. The first one is the new book forms. And these will be the codex, the poti, and the concertina. And then the use of the pen instead of the traditional brush, Chinese brush, and then the direction of writing, and then ligatures. So let's look at the new book forms. So the quintessential Chinese book form, the traditional book form, is the codex, the scroll, which is as you can see, this is a painting, 10th century painting of an official in the underworld reading a scroll, reading people's deeds, the sins and the merits of people. So you see the scroll is held horizontally and the writing on it is vertical, going from right to left, which you cannot see because it's on the other side. But around the beginning of the 10th century or the very end of the 9th century, in Dunhuang, we started having codices or these booklets. And these booklets are actually very similar to the Western codices in that they have quires. And you can see here that this is a this is a fragmentary codex which has 4 quires, and each quire, if I remember correctly, has I think it has 8 bifolia, and the quires are tied together to each other as well. So they're not stitched; they're sewn in the middle, and so this is really something that was not part of Chinese manuscript culture before. This is just comes suddenly, appears in Dunhuang. The earliest dated codex is from 899, but we suppose because there are about 400 of them, and maybe, I don't know, like 20 of them are dated, so they appeared a little bit earlier. And this is the inside, just one part where you can see the how the two different quires are, 2 adjacent quires are joined together. So this type of form is really similar to the Western codex form, and that's why I think we have to consider the obvious conclusion here that there is at this point when Dunhuang is cut off from China, and it's nevertheless part of a much larger Central Asian continuum, that this type of book form is an outside influence. This type of book form is commonly explained in by scholars as an innovation, saying that this is much easier to use and much easier to flip the pages. And so it was invented in Dunhuang because, or maybe in China, because the scrolls were not convenient. And I think it's a fundamentally wrong approach to this problem, because to think that you can use a scroll for 1,000 years, the scrolls for 1,000 years, and that suddenly somebody thinks that there's a better way to do that. And meanwhile, a few hundred or maybe 1,000 miles away, people are using the exact same book form. It's too much of a serendipity. So it must come from the West. And the obvious sources would be either Manichaean book culture or Nestorian, so the Church of the East book culture, which also appeared in China. So we have Christian texts and we have Manichaean texts in Chinese among the Dunhuang manuscripts. Here's another a little bit different type of codex, and you can see it's made of 3 quires, and it's square, and it has these beveled or rounded corners. But it's really interesting how you can see this elaborate thread knotting along the spine. All of these are, or most of these are actually quite small in size, and they all have limp covers, and many of them are actually folded in 2, which is something probably not commonly seen in the West. Here's the inside, the beginning of another codex. You can see the 2 donors worshiping a bodhisattva. So this is a devotional object. And the texts on the inside are basically a series of shorter Buddhist scriptures. Here's another interesting one. I'm just showing it because it's in a way funny, that what seems to be a rabbit here is actually also a donor, and he has these, the hat, which you see in the previous one, is there. So it's really not a rabbit, or in the original catalog, it's described as a monster. Or I don't know which one, but one of them is described as a monster, but it's really just a bad drawing of a bodhisattva and the praying donor. This very, very small, kind of almost the size of a credit card booklet is really interesting because you can see ruling lines on it. So basically, this was folded and cut from a larger sheet of paper, which was part of a scroll, and then folded into this very small size codex. And indeed, we have similar folding structures in among the codices. Like here you have this sheet of paper, where you can see that the bottom part is upside down, and this is the Diamond Sutra. So if you fold it, it kind of, it's incomplete, but basically it folds into a codex format. And what happens is, on the one side, there's the Lotus Sutra, and this is probably an 8th century text or 8th century manuscript. And the Diamond Sutra on the other side is a 10th century manuscript. So they are 200 years apart. And then if you look at the text, it goes in this order. So first the top right, then the left right, and then the third is the bottom left, but the bottom left corner. Then the next book form, which is really interesting also, is the Poti form. And so this, most of the Potis, there are lots of Potis in Dunhuang, most of them are Tibetan. Chinese Potis are not that numerous. There are several dozen, maybe over 100 examples, but they exist. And it's very clear that this Poti form basically derives from the palm leaf manuscripts of South Asia, so India. And this arrives in Dunhuang very likely through Tibetan, through the Tibetans. And so except that in Dunhuang, they become paper leaves rather than made of palm leaf. And you have in the middle, or not in the middle, but somewhere along the central middle, you have a hole for the string, which would hold the leaves together in the original palm leaf manuscript. In Dunhuang, most of these holes are not used. So they're for decoration, sometimes not even perforated. Here's an example of a Tibetan manuscript. It has 2 holes. It's a little bit longer and larger. Again, the holes are not used. In this case, it's very visible that they've never been used. There's one example in Dunhuang where you have a wooden board for a Poti manuscript, and you have a string that actually goes through all of the pages. But this is exceptional. There's only one example, so it's very hard to interpret it, to see what's going on there. Why is it so different from all the others? And then finally, we have the concertina. So this is, once again, a different book form that wasn't there. And it also appears about the same time as all the other 2, the Codex and the Poti manuscripts. So here you see, if it's unfolded partially, then it really looks like this accordion or concertina. And this is an innovation, but it's really interesting that actually, essentially, this is a scroll, but it's put together differently, right? It's folded, and then it's bound or kept in a different form than a scroll. It's not rolled out. So here's the inside. It's the same manuscript, even though it's not as white as the other one. It's a different photograph. So you can see how what it looks like. And actually, in terms of its content, it's quite similar to the other, these booklet types of flat books that I've shown earlier. So this is a series of scriptures, of devotional texts. And actually, based on my own research, I think that these little booklets with these series of scriptures, short scriptures, they are related to the commemoration of the dead. So they are part of a mourning ritual. That's how they were produced, and that's their function. Here's another example. It's a little bit thicker with more leaves, and here is a tiny one, again, the size of a credit card. it's folded very nicely into this stack. And here we have an example of a kind of like a hybrid format. You can see that you have the holes for the poti leaf structure. So, and the format of the page, the individual pages is really this emulating the poti leaves, but in reality, this is a concertina. It's folded that way. You can see that it's bilingual. It has Chinese and Tibetan. Interestingly, the Chinese text is a commentary. It's the main text, but it's a commentary to the sutra called the Masters of the Lanka, or Lankavatara Sutra. And the Tibetan is, which seems like a commentary, but the Tibetan is the actual text. So somebody added, the Chinese does not contain the main text, but somebody added the main text in Tibetan. And I also wanted to show you that this kind of influence coming from outside in terms of the book form is not unidirectional. So here we have, for example, the Chinese scroll format used for Tibetan, for writing Tibetan. So this is a Tibetan manuscript, but interestingly, because the direction of writing and the orientation of the Tibetan script is different, so the surface of the paper is divided into these columns, and that's how Tibetan is written on the paper. And then the booklet, the codex, the Chinese codex format actually also goes from Dunhuang, also goes further west to Turfan, where the Uyghurs lived from about the 10th century or 9th century and the 10th century onward. And it's interesting that you have older Chinese manuscripts used for writing Uyghur texts. And the interesting thing is that the name of the codex, the booklet, in Uyghur is a Chinese loan word. So it's basically kind of makes it very clear that this book form traveled, even though it got to China from somewhere in the West, but to the Uyghurs, it came from China. And you see that the Chinese text is, in one side is upside down and the other one is not. And that's because the way the original Chinese scroll was folded to make this booklet, this codex form. Here's, again, the same manuscript. You can see it's a larger part of it. And then Chinese book, like page numbers, for example, also started to be used on other manuscripts. So the Chinese did not have page numbers until this point. Page numbers appear with these new formats, new book forms, which have pages. And then, interestingly, then the same, even though like the codex, the poti form was borrowed from Tibetan culture, then sometimes you start having Chinese page numbers on Tibetan manuscripts. And I think that's also a really interesting phenomenon which hasn't been looked at much before. So then we look at the use of the pen instead of the brush. And that's, again, a really, really interesting phenomenon specific to Dunhuang studies. So the study of manuscripts from this particular region in Northwest China. So this is an early manuscript from 608, so the beginning of the 7th century. And this is written with a brush. And you can see that the brush strokes have a certain quality. Sometimes they go very thick, and then sometimes they go thinner. And apparently this can be done primarily with the brush. But when we get into this, let's say the 850s and onwards, then we start having these other types of characters or other types of calligraphy, which is very clear that it was not written with a brush. This was written with a pen, a hard pen, as they say. And in Dunhuang, this was probably reed, either made of reed or other type, or just wood, certain kind of wood. And the interesting thing is that, okay, this is a very informally done copy of a scripture, a very short scripture, but then occasionally you have much better done ones. And what's interesting is if you look at the last strokes, or sometimes the beginnings also, then they're retouched. So sometimes they're filled in, as in the contours are filled in with the pen. So even when writing with a pen, people would emulate brush written strokes, which was probably the aesthetic standard, but they would write with a pen. The interesting explanation about this switch to using the pen, and this was unlike the codex and the poti and all these book forms, which were in a way exceptional. So there are only a few hundred of them amidst this ocean of 50, 60, 70,000 other scroll types of manuscripts. The use of the pen was quite universal, let's say, after this period. So suddenly people started writing with a pen. And this is often explained by being cut off from China. So not being able to import brushes. And I think this reflects a kind of a Sinocentric point of view, seeing China as the source of civilization. And then once Dunhuang is cut off, then it's kind of doesn't have the good, the elite, the civilized things anymore, which is obviously a flawed perspective. So I think this is the use of the pen is more like a cultural choice. It's obviously it's a preference because you can make brushes easily locally, and obviously brushes were, for most people, were never imported from China, so they would have made them locally. But it's an interesting point where people kind of disagree on what might have caused this phenomenon. And then the direction of writing, which is, again, a fascinating topic because Chinese is written vertically, in vertical columns, going from right to left. And then occasionally you have, for example, here, the colophon, which identifies this person as somebody called Li Shunzi, who is a local officer. So the colophon is written from left to right, also in vertical columns. So there are very, very few cases of this in Chinese history. Occasionally this happens, let's say in the 5th century BC, here and there, but there's no tradition of writing this way. And yet in Dunhuang, suddenly you have these snippets of text that are written in this particular way. It's really an anomaly. And because you have over 100 of these examples, we have to assume that something is happening here. So this is not a accidental or incidental phenomenon, but it reflects some sort of cultural change. Here's another example. This is even rarer. So there are only two. This is the same poti leaf, Tibetan style poti leaf. But there is only another one that I've seen that has this horizontal Chinese text going from left to right. And this is how Chinese is written today, mostly, or on the internet, for example. So we're very much used to it, but I think for somebody in central China, this period, this would have been very, very bizarre, very strange. And here we have to assume that the Tibetan style book form and the Tibetan style direction of writing is connected. So this is an impact from Tibetan manuscript culture, this kind of writing. Here is a printed example, one of the few examples of printed text, and you have the central kind of deity here with the circular inscription in Sanskrit, and then you have a Chinese text. And then around it, you have several smaller identical copies of these spells, which are for relieving childbirth difficulties or pain in childbirth. So we can assume that probably these were cut out and then worn on a body or something like that when needed. And the printed inscription in Chinese is, again, it goes from left to right in vertical columns, which is, again, very, very unusual otherwise. So in Dunhuang, does not seem so unusual. And this type of writing actually is even more common on the paintings, the silk paintings that come out of the same Dunhuang cave. There are about 300-400 of these paintings. And so they depict, like here, they depict the deity Avalokiteshvara, and at the bottom you have the donors and the donor family. And the inscription, which explains the whole motivation behind this, is going from left to right. And not only in this picture, but almost all of them, almost in all paintings where you have this kind of inscription, this is the norm. So because of that, we have to assume that this is somehow, especially with the donor inscription, we have to assume that this is somehow related to the identity of these donors. And so here you have on the right the man, on the left the women, and then the children at the bottom. If we look at the main donors, so the main donor on the right is the male donor. His name is Mi and De. And Mi as a surname reflects a Sogdian background, a Sogdian ancestry in China. So his family, and we don't know how long back, but his family ultimately comes from Central Asia, from Sogdiana. And his wife has a surname of Cao, and she also very likely of Sogdian descent. So these are Central Asian people, acculturated or integrated into Chinese type of culture, but maybe preserving some of their Central Asian habits. And then finally, I want to mention these ligatures, which is also a really, really interesting thing, is that from about this period, you start having these ligatures for certain type of words. And these words are all related to Buddhism, and not just anything, but basically you have Bodhisattva, so one of the enlightened being, one of the saints we could call in Buddhism, and then enlightenment, so the goal, the whole goal of Buddhism, and nirvana, again, a goal of Buddhism. So here's how this word is written in Chinese today. And of course, Bodhisattva is, the Chinese word Pusa is not a Chinese word, it's a transcription of, or transliteration of an Indic term, so like a Sanskrit term. But basically in the ligature, it's only the top bits of each character are represented. So it's an abbreviation, and it forms this very distinct visual form. It's almost like in the West, you have the nomina sacra. So it becomes a visual sign in a sense. And the same happens with the word for enlightenment, puti. You have two different forms. And one of them, the first one basically derives from the bodhisattva, the previous one. And then for nirvana, you have a kind of a simple form, but you can't really say how it derives or how it's connected to the characters. It doesn't really connect to it. So it's maybe its origins are different. It's really, really interesting that for the previous 800 years of Buddhist tradition, you didn't have this. And then suddenly at this point, this period when Dunhuang is integrated more deeply into Central Asian culture and has contacts with other written traditions, then you suddenly start using these forms. occasionally there are other ligatures like Fuozi, so son of the Buddha, which are written in this abbreviated form, but written together as one graph. As you can see, Chinese writing is separated into individual graphs. And so this whole concept is written together as one unit. And then finally, the last one is this Liao Ye. Here you have two characters written like this, and on both Chinese manuscripts and Uyghur manuscripts, you use it. You use this Chinese ligature, this sign basically, which just means finished. And so this is not necessarily related to Buddhism, but it does appear on Buddhist manuscripts. And finally, just a few things to mention, the deterioration of paper. So these are not innovations, obviously. These are just changes that happen at the same time. So Chinese manuscripts normally are written on this kind of paper. This is, of course, a very well done manuscript that comes from the Chinese court, from the Tang court. But that in this 10th century Dunhuang, you suddenly start having this type of manuscripts on this type of paper, or like this one. And I think there's really no difference or no real change in the paper. It's just basically that we have many more manuscripts from this 10th century, and then we have many more of these kinds of manuscripts, whereas the older manuscripts which have been preserved, so it's usually the better manuscripts that are preserved, and this kind of everyday less nice looking manuscripts are not preserved from the earlier period. And the change of word order, this is again a very interesting thing that reflects some sort of Central Asian influence. Here's, for example, a painting on paper of the deity Vaishravana, one of the heavenly kings. And you have two donor inscriptions, actually three, because at the bottom you also have one in Khotanese horizontally. And the word order is completely wrong. Sorry for the misspelling. It's completely wrong for Chinese. So the word order in Chinese, it's the subject, verb, object, and then here you have subject, object, verb in both cases. And that's just not how you can write in Chinese. So this we have to assume that probably either this was written by somebody who was mainly speaking a different language, or maybe it's not even in Chinese. So it looks like Chinese, but it's vocalized in a different language. Let's say similar to how, say, Japanese reads Chinese characters. So this is a clear Central Asian influence, and because of the Khotanese inscription at the bottom, I think we can safely attribute this to the influence of Khotanese culture. And finally, this messy characters and mistakes are, again, something that's very hard to judge, but it has been pointed out in the past by me as well, that this might reflect, again, an external influence, a non-Chinese influence. So here is this tiny concertina that I showed earlier. You have completely miswritten the title of the scripture, the character for the lotus. This is the Lotus Sutra. And then an even more interesting example is that you have the word zhongzhong, which means various or all kinds of, two identical characters. And even if you don't read Chinese, you can see that they're kind of dyslexically reversed. So the correct way is writing is as it's written at the bottom, and the top one is just not a viable character. So it's a mistake. You can see that the rest of the characters are also not very well written. So this is a very crudely done manuscript. Whether these things reflect actually a external influence or just reflect the writing skills of some people or the age maybe of some people, I think it's still a question. And to sum up basically my talk, I showed these examples to illustrate how the manuscripts from Dunhuang, even the Chinese ones, which we'll look at, which are basically always looked at as done by Chinese people in Chinese characters, they reflect kind of the Chinese tradition. But in reality, this was a region which was outside of China at this point. And being cut off from China did not mean that it kind of ceased to exist as a cultural center. It was part of a much larger cultural continuum. So partly the Tibetan Empire and later basically the Central Asian continuum, which had its own culture, different one from China. So these influences, I think, kind of reflect very interestingly the makeup of local society, and it would be very interesting to see, for example, the appearance of the codex, where it comes from. So these ties to Central Asia, but possibly even further to the West, are something that I'm most looking forward to exploring. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Imre, for this wonderful talk. Just fascinating material, and so clearly and well explained for those of us who are not, sinologists and not experts in this material. I'm sure we'll have some questions from the audience. I guess I have a sort of general question just to start off while we're waiting. If people want to type their questions or say in the chat that they have a question they'd like to speak, to say out loud. Can you give us a sense of, how extraordinary a survival the library at Dunhuang, or the cave, is? Have there been other sort of smaller caches of documents discovered? Are there more that may be discovered one day, or has this kind of region been examined archaeologically, extremely extensively since? And sort of, how many other sort of 10th century Chinese documents or Central Asian documents do we have from other regions, and how many have sort of survived outside of outside of an archaeological or semi-archaeological context? Like, how many have survived just perhaps in libraries or monasteries?
Okay, so starting from the second part of your question, about how many survived outside, just basically continuously survived. And so not many, but quite a number of them did survive in Japan. So it's really interesting how many of these early, mostly Buddhist texts, they survive in Japan, and which is also quite interesting, because people often say that, okay, so there's this phenomenon that all of these sites that we have, or most of the sites that we have, are in the Northwest, in desert climate. And so quite often people say that it's because of the desert climate that they survive, whereas in central China, they don't survive because the climate is not as dry and it's more humid or something. But Japan is really, really humid. Nevertheless, a large number of these early Chinese or medieval Chinese manuscripts survive there. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. And many of them are being newly discovered these days, because they have been kind of part of monastery collections, and so they're not really out in the open. But once they become known, of course, they incite a lot of interest. As far as in China, yes, so other than Dunhuang, there are several other sites. For example, the one in Karakoto, which is not that far away from Dunhuang, but it's maybe about 2 centuries or 2.5 centuries later. And it's from a region which was under Tangut control. So the Tanguts were another state or another empire, another people speaking their own language and writing their own language. And so these manuscripts, when they were found also in 1908, then they basically they led to the decipherment of that language and that script. And so they would, I think there are about 20-something thousand, not just manuscripts, but also printed texts, because just this 2.5 centuries also meant that there were a lot more prints and there were a lot less scrolls, interestingly. So there was this shift to other book forms there as well. And then further to the west, from Turfan, so it's the center basically of this Uyghur region, you also have lots of manuscripts discovered from there, but not from one site, but from a series of tombs, caves. And over the years, so there hasn't been one major site, one major finding, but over the years, they've actually gradually, the collection built up. So there are really thousands and thousands of manuscripts from Turfan as well. But not so much from central China. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. I have a couple of other questions, but I wonder if someone in the audience, Kathleen Baldanza, would you like to unmute and ask the question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for this really fascinating talk. I have a question thinking about the Dunhuang manuscripts as a whole. You mentioned that that people could have produced brushes locally if they had wanted to use brushes. So I'm wondering about the production of these texts and the paper, if that was a local industry or if a lot of these books were brought in from other places, or what we know about, you know, paper making, scribal practices, were people producing these texts at the site or bringing them in from all over?
Well, we assume that most of the texts were produced locally. And so there's evidence of some texts. For example, there was that beautiful scroll that I showed you, nice yellow color, and that came from the capital in central China. So there were, I don't know, 24 manuscripts like that, and they were a number. So basically, maybe 100, 200 manuscripts came from other places, or at least we can ascertain that they came from other places. For the rest, it's not that clear. So we have to assume that they were probably produced locally. And paper production must have been significant, actually, but maybe this was not unusual. I wouldn't say that Dunhuang was a center of paper production. It's just Buddhist culture is very text oriented. And so lots of manuscripts were produced. So copying sutras was an act of merit making. And so everybody engaged in this. And as I mentioned in passing, the mortuary culture, so the funerary rites and mourning rituals also involved the production of scriptures. And so this was probably the case for many other places throughout East Asia.
Lynn, you have a question.
I do have a question. Thank you. This was really great. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the concertina as an innovation. Is the suggestion, or am I just reading into this, that it was in response to the codex as a solution for handling scrolls, or what makes it an innovation, I guess? How is it innovated?
Well, it's innovation in the sense that it hasn't been there. Mm-hmm. So it's a new technology that wasn't part of the previous cultural landscape. So maybe if you don't like the word innovation, then we can say
I'm fine with innovation. I'm just wondering, because I think you said what was it? I can't remember what you said that wasn't an innovation, but I thought it was interesting that if the codex was the sort of what was the codex the influencing factor on the concertina?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, they appear at the same time. It's very hard. I guess the word innovation is not quite right because it implies a betterment in a sense, but I don't mean to say that. I'm just saying that there were changes, there were new developments. So, because for example, if you think the codex as it is explained today, sometimes it was an innovation because it was better to find something in a codex, but in reality that wasn't the case because there are only 400 codices, and then you have this massive amount of scrolls even after the codices came in.
Right.
So nobody was using them on a larger scale, right? So there were just a few people or a few dozen people who used the codex form, and that it didn't catch on. But as for the concertina, yes, the concertina appeared about the same time as the poti and the codex. And it's really interesting that all three of these are flat forms, right? So they with pages. So it's possible that there was an influence there, especially if you look at the size or the dimensions of these booklets. They're quite similar. So some of the concertinas, if you look at them, they look like a codex. You don't know until you open them.
Right.
So there was definitely some sort of fluidity between them, or interaction between them, which is also underscored by the fact that they appeared out of nowhere, so to speak, at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. I think I just hadn't really thought about the two formats in relation to, one to the other. So it's really interesting to see that. Thank you.
We have a question, we have several questions. I think Melissa Morrison was the first. I'll read it. So you asked, how does the choice of book format relate to genre, and size of book relate to genre?
Basically, there is some relationship between with genre, because the codex, for example, has two main types of text. So one is Buddhist scriptures, and sometimes there are these series of short scriptures, and the other is you have primers, so these educational texts used by probably used by students for practice. So these are completely different two functions. So as I said, one of them, the type of codex that has this series of short texts, are maybe related to commemorating the deceased, but the other one is surely not, the one with these texts about students, or just very simple primers, basically. As for the size of the book, it's hard to say, because all of them are very small, or most of them are very small. So occasionally there's one or two that are larger, and there does not seem to be any sort of particular reason for that, based on the text, for that being larger. But we have to assume that this small format was somehow related to the book being portable, right? Or even like you could hide it somewhere or something like that, because some of them are extremely small, so maybe not even helpful to read. So there's maybe a relation to function, and I guess function is also related to the genre. But yeah, I think we need to look more into this, to look at it more carefully, maybe statistically. There's nothing obvious, as far as I can see.
We have a question from Yan Liu. Do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Actually, is following up question from the previous question. The portability of the manuscript, particularly my question is about the Poti manuscript. It's interesting to see that some of the manuscripts of this type, they have a hole, but it's not really a hole, it's a dot there. And others, there's actually a hole. So I wonder how many of these manuscripts, based on existing evidence, are actually used being portable, carry with the body, or alternative hypothesis would be, they're just writing practice without being actually put into practice. I wonder whether you can offer some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, as for being carried on the body, it's very hard to say because they're found in a cave. So how would you know if they were carried on the body? I mean, I can think of two things here. One is that you have oil stains on them and things like that, but that can also happen if they're stored on the table, something. Another thing is that, as I mentioned, some of them, especially the codices, they are folded in half. So even though they were small, really small, they were sometimes folded in half, making them even smaller. So I think that's kind of an indication that maybe they were carried around, but there's no actual evidence for that. So I don't think it makes sense to fold something and put it on your shelf because it doesn't preserve better than if you just lay it out. If it's a small, flat, passport size manuscript.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And we have another question from Sarah Guerin.
Thank you for this really fascinating talk, introducing just a wealth of material that's of interest to sort of global lists quite widely. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more on something you mentioned at the very beginning of the talk when you were looking at the archaeological photos of those bundles of scrolls. And you had mentioned that those are now realized to have had kind of a codicological value or sort of organizational value. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how that was realized after the archaeologists took everything apart and kind of what's being done to reconstruct that.
Yes, okay, so these things were not really found by archaeologists, or they were not excavated in a sense. They were just purchased, right? And so foreign explorers, British, French, Japanese, Russian ones, they just bought them in bulk and then they carried them away. So and as part of that activity, basically they didn't pay attention to this because they unrolled or opened these bundles and took the scrolls out, right? Because somehow everybody thought the scroll was the unit. But apparently it's just recently in the past 15 years probably that it has been realized that many of these bundles are somehow connected with the organization of the Buddhist canon. So it's these, like, even though they're different texts, you would nevertheless put them together as a subcategory in the canon. And then the bundles, there are some photographs, some of these early photographs, which have labels on them. The bundle has a label. And that's how it was realized that it's really, actually, it's related to the organization of the canon. And so this is a huge loss that we don't have that information now. And I know some scholars like Susan Whitfield, for example, they're trying to piece together some of this evidence based on for example, the sutra wrappers. So they were these wrappers that used for the bundles. They should be called bundle wrappers, actually. Yeah. And, but this is kind of, it's not an easy task, right? So some of the, I think these bundle wrappers were not even cataloged initially. And some of them are really well done. So they ended up in museums like the British Museum or the Musée Guimet in Paris, separate from the manuscripts, which went to the libraries.